Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy true horror and unsettling stories. When my son was a little over a year and a half old, he had just begun noticing the difference between day and night. Of course, he was still too young to understand the actual words day and night, so in his small world he simply called them light and dark. During the day he would happily point out the window and say, "Light," smiling as the sun filled the room. When evening came and the sky slowly changed colors, he would look around with curiosity and whisper, "Dark," as if it were a quiet visitor arriving at our house. At that age, everything was still new to him. He was learning how the world worked, one tiny discovery at a time. I remember watching him wander around the living room during the daytime, chasing the sunlight that spilled across the carpet. Sometimes he would sit near the window and stare outside, completely fascinated by the trees moving in the wind or by cars passing on the street. His eyes always had that bright, curious look children have when they're trying to understand something much bigger than themselves. Our house was old but comfortable. It had large windows that looked out toward the backyard where several tall trees stood close together. During the daytime, the branches made soft shadows across the lawn, but at night, those same trees could look completely different. When the wind blew, the branches would sway and scratch lightly against each other, creating shapes and movements that sometimes felt a little unsettling if you stared at them for too long. One evening, when my son was a little over a year and a half old, the weather was gloomy. The day had been gray from the beginning, and by the time evening arrived, the sky had turned into a deep shade of dark purple. Thick clouds covered the moon, and the wind had picked up enough to make the branches outside move wildly. Inside the house, it was quiet. The only sounds were the faint hum of the refrigerator and the wind brushing against the windows. I had been in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner when I noticed that the living room had grown unusually still. My son had been playing on the floor with a few wooden blocks only a few minutes earlier. When I glanced into the room again, the blocks were still scattered across the carpet, but he wasn't sitting there anymore. Instead, he was standing by the large window that faced the backyard. He had both of his tiny hands pressed against the glass, his forehead leaning forward slightly as he stared outside. The room behind him was dimly lit by a single lamp, which made his small figure look almost like a silhouette against the window. For a moment, I simply stood there and watched him. Outside, the trees were swaying in the wind. Their branches looked almost black against the dark purple sky. Every now and then, the wind would grow stronger and push the branches into strange shapes, making them twist and wave slowly in the darkness. It was one of those evenings where the world outside felt unusually quiet and heavy, as if something unseen was moving through the air. My son didn't seem scared at all. In fact, he looked calm, completely focused. I walked slowly toward him and knelt beside him so I could see what he was looking at. From where we stood, the backyard looked darker than usual. The grass had turned into a dull gray shape, and the trees looked taller than they did during the day. The wind pushed the branches back and forth, creating long shadows that stretched across the yard. For a moment, I thought maybe he was just watching the trees move. Children often find simple things fascinating, especially things that move in slow, unpredictable ways. Still, something about the way he was standing there felt different. He wasn't pointing or laughing the way he usually did when he noticed something interesting. He was simply staring, quiet and still. I gently asked him, "What are you looking at?" My voice was soft, almost casual. I expected him to turn and point at the trees or maybe say something about the wind. Instead, He slowly turned his head toward me. There was a wide smile on his face, the kind of innocent smile toddlers give when they are proud of something they've noticed. Then he said something in the cheerful tone he used whenever he discovered something new. "Dark is here." He said it so naturally, so happily, as if he were announcing the arrival of a familiar friend. For a second, I didn't say anything. At first, I assumed he was simply noticing that nighttime had arrived. That would have been the logical explanation. After all, he had just started recognizing the difference between light and dark. But something about the way he said it made my stomach tighten slightly. Not "it's dark," not "I see dark." He said it like he was describing something that had come to visit. Dark is here. I glanced back out the window. The wind outside had grown stronger, pushing the tree branches into long, twisting shapes against the sky. The clouds moved slowly across the darkness, blocking out what little light remained in the evening sky. For a moment, I had the strange feeling that the backyard looked deeper than usual, as if the darkness itself had grown heavier. Of course, that was probably just my imagination. Still, the words lingered in my mind longer than they should have. Children often say strange things. Their minds are constantly trying to understand the world, and sometimes the way they describe things can sound a little unusual to adults. I reminded myself of that as I gently lifted my son away from the window. He laughed and clapped his hands as I carried him toward the couch. Within minutes, he was back to stacking his blocks and knocking them over again like nothing had happened. But I found myself glancing toward the window more than once that evening. Every time I looked, the backyard seemed darker than before. The branches continued to sway slowly in the wind, creating shapes that appeared and disappeared between the shadows. Eventually, I turned on another lamp in the living room, brightening the space enough that the window became more of a reflection than a view into the yard. Later that night, after my son had fallen asleep, I walked quietly through the house, turning off lights before heading to bed. When I reached the living room again, the house was silent. The window stood there in the darkness, showing the faint outline of the trees outside. For a brief moment, I remembered his words again. "Dark is here." A strange chill ran down my back. And without really thinking about it, I looked over my shoulder. The room behind me was empty, just the quiet hallway and the soft shadows created by the dim light near the stairs. I shook my head slightly, almost laughing at myself. It was just a child noticing nighttime, nothing more. Still, even now, years later, I sometimes remember that moment when evening arrives and the sky begins to fade into darker shades. There are nights when I'm sitting alone in a quiet room and the light outside slowly disappears. The windows turn black, reflecting the inside of the room instead of showing the outside world. And every once in a while, when the house becomes completely still and the night settles in, I find myself remembering the way my son smiled that evening, the way he pressed his small hands against the glass, the calm way he announced it. Dark is here. And every time that memory returns, I can't help but glance over my shoulder just once more, half expecting to see something standing quietly in the corner of the room, waiting patiently in the darkness. My grandmother passed away in March of 2009. It was one of those quiet, heavy days that seemed to stretch longer than normal. The weather itself almost felt like it understood what had happened. The sky stayed gray most of the time, and the air carried that strange silence that often comes after someone important in your life is suddenly gone. Our whole family gathered for the visitation. It was an open casket service, something that I had always found difficult. But at the same time, it felt important to be there. My grandmother had been a central part of our family for as long as I could remember. She was the kind of person who made every house feel warm the moment she stepped inside. Her laugh filled rooms. Her voice had that soft, comforting tone that made you feel like everything was going to be all right, no matter what. Seeing her lying there in the casket felt strange in a way that's hard to explain. She was dressed in a seafoam green pantsuit, one that many of us recognized immediately because she had worn it to several family gatherings over the years. Her hair had been styled the way she always liked it, lightly colored with a soft golden shade that matched the way we all remembered her. For a moment, it almost felt like she was simply resting, but of course everyone in the room knew that wasn't the case. People moved slowly through the visitation line, speaking quietly, offering condolences, hugging one another in that careful way people do during moments of grief. I remember standing beside my parents, looking around the room and seeing relatives I hadn't seen in years. Some of them had traveled from different states just to be there. When it was finally my turn to approach the casket, I stood there for a moment longer than I expected to. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to say or do. Part of me wanted to talk to her like she could still hear me, but another part of me knew that it might make the moment feel even more overwhelming. So instead, I simply stood there quietly. I looked at her face, trying to memorize it, the way it looked in that moment, because I knew this would be the last time I would ever see her like that. After a few seconds, I whispered a quiet goodbye under my breath. Then I stepped away so the next person in line could come forward. The service ended later that evening. People slowly began leaving the funeral home, walking out into the cool night air. My parents stayed behind for a while longer to speak with other family members, but I had already planned to head back to Ohio. At the time, I was still in school there, and classes were starting again soon. Life has a strange way of continuing, even when you feel like it should pause for a while. So after saying my goodbyes to everyone, I got into my car and began the drive back. The highway felt unusually quiet that night. The headlights from other cars passed by slowly, and the road stretched ahead in long, dark lines. Most of the time, my mind wandered back to memories of my grandmother. Little things came back to me during that drive. The way she used to make breakfast when we stayed over at her house as kids. The way she would always keep extra snacks hidden in the kitchen for us. The way she hugged people tightly, like she wanted them to feel safe for just a few seconds longer before letting go. Those memories stayed with me during the entire drive. Eventually, time moved forward the way it always does. Weeks passed. School became busy again. Assignments piled up, and daily routines slowly filled the spaces where grief had been sitting. But the loss was still there, quietly present in the background. A few weeks after the funeral, I decided to visit my grandfather. I knew that the weeks after losing someone can sometimes be the hardest, especially for the person who had shared a home with them for decades. My grandparents had been married for a very long time. Their lives had been completely intertwined. I wanted to check in on him, see how he was doing, and spend some time with the family. When I arrived at the house, it looked exactly the same as it always had. The same driveway, the same trees in the yard, the same quiet neighborhood street. But there was something different about the atmosphere. The house felt slightly emptier somehow, even before I stepped inside. When I walked through the front door, several of my family members were already there. My dad was in the living room, speaking quietly with my uncle. My aunt was sitting near the kitchen table. Everyone greeted me warmly, but there was still that lingering sadness in the air. After a few minutes of talking, someone mentioned that Grandpa was in his bedroom, so I walked down the hallway to check on him. As I approached the doorway, I noticed something unusual. Almost the entire family was gathered in his room. My dad, my uncle, my aunt, and a couple of other relatives were standing there, all facing the same direction. They were staring upward at the television mounted high above the closet. My grandfather had always kept his television in an unusual spot. It sat on the top shelf of his closet, about 8 feet above the floor. To watch it, you had to tilt your head upward slightly. What caught my attention wasn't just the fact that everyone was watching it. It was the expressions on their faces. They looked completely still. Their faces were serious, almost tense, like they had just seen something that they couldn't quite believe. When I stepped into the room, no one spoke right away. I glanced up at the television to see what they were watching. The screen showed EWTN, a Catholic television network that my grandfather watched almost constantly. He was an extremely religious man, and most of the programs he recorded were sermons, documentaries about biblical history, or discussions about religious topics. The video was paused. On the screen was a large crowd of people walking through what looked like ancient stone ruins. The buildings around them appeared old, possibly from somewhere in the Middle East. The camera angle was positioned slightly above the crowd, looking down at them diagonally. Everyone in the room continued staring at the screen. Then, almost at the exact same moment, several voices said one word: "Watch." My grandfather reached for the remote and pressed play. The video began moving again. The camera showed hundreds of people walking closely together through narrow stone paths. The colors were dull and muted. Most of the people were wearing simple clothing, mostly plain shades of brown, gray, and beige. They moved quickly, like a busy crowd passing through a historical site or marketplace. None of them seemed to notice the camera. The camera itself appeared to be positioned above them, capturing the crowd from a slightly elevated angle. At first, nothing seemed particularly unusual. It was just a large group of people walking. Then something shifted slightly in my peripheral vision. Out of the corner of my eye, I noticed my aunt suddenly tense up. She raised her hand to cover her mouth, as if she was bracing herself for something. Almost at the exact same moment, several people in the room gasped. I followed their gaze back to the center of the screen, and that's when I saw it. In the middle of the moving crowd was a woman. At first, she blended in with the people around her, but then something about her appearance stood out immediately. She was wearing a seafoam green pantsuit. Her hair was golden, the exact same color and style my grandmother had been wearing during the visitation. She wasn't looking around like the other people. She was staring directly into the camera. Her face had no expression at all. For about 3 seconds, she remained in the center of the frame, looking straight toward the camera lens as the crowd moved around her. Then, slowly, the movement of the crowd swallowed her. She disappeared among the people, and the camera continued showing the crowd walking as if nothing unusual had happened. The room exploded with reactions. People began shouting, gasping, and talking all at once. My aunt started crying. My dad stepped closer to the television as if he couldn't believe what he had just seen. My grandfather kept pointing at the screen, repeating that everyone had seen it. Even I felt a strange chill run down my spine. It didn't make sense. The clothing matched exactly. The hair matched exactly. Even the posture and the way she held her head felt familiar. But logically, there was no way it could have been her. The program had been filmed somewhere far away, most likely years before it ever aired on television. Yet for those 3 seconds, every person in that room saw the same thing. A woman who looked exactly like my grandmother, standing in the middle of an ancient crowd, looking directly at the camera, looking directly at us. I'm not a particularly religious person. I've never considered myself very superstitious either. Most of the time I prefer logical explanations for things. And even now, years later, I still try to tell myself that it must have been a coincidence. Maybe it was simply someone who happened to look remarkably similar to her. But every time I remember the way the entire room reacted at the same moment, the way everyone gasped before anyone had time to say a word, and the way that woman stared straight into the camera for those few silent seconds. I still feel a cold shiver run down my spine, even now. When I was a kid, I used to experience something that I didn't understand at the time. Back then, I didn't even know there was a name for it. I only knew that sometimes when I was falling asleep or waking up, something strange would happen to me. Years later, I learned that it was called sleep paralysis, but when I was young, it felt like something much more mysterious and frightening. It didn't happen every night, but it happened often enough that I started to recognize the feeling when it began. The first sign was always the same. I would be lying down, usually feeling tired and drifting towards sleep, and suddenly my body would stop responding to me. My mind would still be awake, or at least partially awake, but I couldn't move my arms or legs. Sometimes I couldn't even open my eyes. As a kid, that feeling alone was terrifying. When you're young, you don't really understand what's happening inside your body during sleep. You just know that something is wrong. I remember the first few times it happened, I tried desperately to move. I would try to lift my arm or turn my head, but it felt like my entire body had been glued to the bed or the couch. No matter how hard I tried, nothing worked. My breathing would feel heavy, like there was weight pressing down on my chest. I could hear the quiet sounds around the house, but I couldn't react to them. Eventually, the feeling would pass. My body would suddenly release, and I'd be able to move again as if nothing had happened. But one experience in particular stayed with me for years. I must have been fairly young at the time, probably still in elementary school. It was evening, the kind of calm, quiet evening where nothing unusual seems to be happening. My family was somewhere else in the house, doing their own things. I had wandered into the living room and decided to lie down for a while. The living room had a long couch that faced the television, and beside it was a large window that looked out toward the street. During the day, the room felt bright and comfortable, but at night the lighting was softer and the corners of the room sometimes faded into shadow. I remember lying down on the couch and pulling a blanket over myself. The television was off, and the room was mostly quiet, except for the occasional sound of a car passing outside. At first, I wasn't even trying to sleep. I was just resting there, letting my mind wander the way it sometimes does when you're tired, but not fully ready for bed. Eventually, my eyes grew heavy. That slow, drifting feeling began, the one where your thoughts start becoming less clear as sleep creeps closer. And then it happened. At first, it felt familiar, that strange sensation where your body becomes heavy and still. I tried to move my arms slightly, just to adjust my position, but nothing happened. I tried again. Still nothing. My body wouldn't respond. But that's when I realized the sleep paralysis had started. Even though I had experienced it before, it still scared me every time. My mind immediately began trying to wake my body up. I tried to open my eyes, but they wouldn't move. It felt like my eyelids were sealed shut. My breathing became slow and heavy. I could still hear the quiet sounds of the house, the faint hum of something electrical in the background, the distant creaking sounds that houses sometimes make at night. At that moment, I was hoping the paralysis would pass quickly like it usually did, but instead, something else began to happen. At first, it was just a sound, a strange buzzing noise. It was faint at the beginning, almost like the sound of electricity or a distant vibration, the kind of sound you might hear from an old fluorescent light or a power line. But there were no lights on in the room, and the buzzing didn't feel like it was coming from the walls. It felt closer. It started growing louder, and not suddenly, but gradually, like something slowly approaching. The sound seemed to fill the room, vibrating softly through the air. It had a strange mechanical quality to it, almost like a low electrical hum. My mind immediately started racing. As a kid, lying there unable to move while hearing a strange noise was one of the worst feelings imaginable. I tried again to open my eyes. Nothing. My body still refused to move. The buzzing continued getting louder. And then something happened that made the entire situation far worse. I heard a voice. At first it was quiet, so quiet that I wasn't even sure if I had imagined it. But then I heard it again. The voice said my name. It didn't sound like anyone in my family. It didn't sound familiar at all. The voice was strange and distorted, almost like it was echoing through a tunnel or vibrating through the buzzing sound that filled the room. It said my name slowly, then it said it again. Each time it spoke, the buzzing sound seemed to grow louder. The voice repeated my name over and over, each time a little louder than the last, and each time it sounded closer. At that moment, my mind was completely panicking. I couldn't see anything because my eyes were still closed, but it felt like something was standing somewhere in the room. Something slowly moving closer to where I was lying. The voice kept repeating my name, again, and again, and again. Each time the sound felt like it was right next to me. As a kid, that moment felt endless. My mind was screaming for my body to wake up, to move, to do anything, but my body was still frozen. The buzzing filled my ears. The voice kept saying my name, louder, closer, more intense. It felt like the voice was leaning over me, right beside my head, calling my name directly into my ear. Then suddenly, everything stopped. In an instant, my body snapped awake. My eyes flew open and I sat up quickly on the couch, breathing heavily. The living room was completely normal, quiet, empty. The lights from outside faintly lit the room through the window. There was no buzzing sound, no voice, no one standing nearby. My heart was racing so fast I could feel it pounding in my chest. I looked around the room expecting to see someone there, but the room was completely empty. It took a few minutes for my breathing to slow down. Even though everything looked normal again, the fear didn't disappear right away. I remember sitting there for a long time, trying to convince myself that it had just been a dream. But it didn't feel like a dream. I had been awake the entire time. Or at least it had felt that way. The whole experience stayed with me for days. As a kid, it really messed with my head. For several nights afterward, I had trouble falling asleep. Every time I started drifting off, I would remember that voice and that buzzing sound. I kept wondering what would happen if it came back. Eventually, the fear faded the way childhood fears often do. Life moved on. School, friends, normal daily routines slowly pushed the memory into the background. Years later, when I learned what sleep paralysis actually was, I realized that strange sounds and voices can sometimes happen during those episodes. The brain can create very realistic hallucinations when it's stuck between sleep and wakefulness. Knowing that explanation made the experience easier to understand. But even now, when I think back to that moment lying on the couch, hearing that voice slowly saying my name while I couldn't move, I still feel a small chill run down my spine. Because no matter how many scientific explanations there are, that moment as a kid felt incredibly real. And the memory of that voice calling my name from somewhere in the dark is something I've never completely forgotten. When I was in 8th grade, my family lived in a quiet, gated community. It was the kind of neighborhood where the houses were built pretty close to each other. There was only about 10 feet of space between our house and the neighbor's place next door. There wasn't a fence or a wall separating the yards, just a narrow strip of grass and a few small plants that ran along the side of the houses. During the day, it always felt calm and safe. Kids rode their bikes around the streets. The neighbors waved to each other, and the security guard at the gate gave everyone a sense that nothing bad could really happen there. Inside our house, my bedroom was the only one located downstairs. My parents and the rest of the rooms were upstairs. At the time, I actually liked having the room to myself because it felt more private. I had my own little space away from everyone else, but that also meant that at night I was the only one sleeping on the ground floor. One night, something happened that I still remember very clearly. I don't know what time it was exactly, but it had to be late. The house was completely quiet, the kind of quiet you only notice in the middle of the night. I suddenly woke up for no clear reason. It wasn't like I heard a loud noise or anything. Sometimes you just wake up suddenly, and that's what it felt like. My eyes opened slowly while I was still half asleep, trying to figure out why I had woken up. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I turned my head slightly toward the window next to my bed. That's when I saw something move. At first, it was only a quick glimpse, just a shadow shifting past the glass, but it was enough to make my brain immediately snap awake. I froze in place and stared toward the window. My heart started beating faster almost instantly. Standing outside my window was a person. The figure had been moving when I first noticed it, but the moment I looked in that direction, they stopped completely. It was like they had frozen in place the exact second I opened my eyes. The darkness made it hard to see details. I couldn't clearly make out their face or even exactly what they were wearing. All I could see was the outline of someone standing there, just a few feet from the glass. For a few seconds, I wasn't even sure if what I was seeing was real. Maybe it was just a shadow from a tree or something moving in the wind. But the longer I stared, the more obvious it became that it wasn't a shadow at all. It was a person. Someone standing outside my bedroom window in the middle of the night. The scariest part was that they weren't moving anymore. They were just standing there. I remember lying completely still in bed, staring at the window while the figure stayed perfectly frozen on the other side. My mind was racing with questions. Did they know I was awake? Could they see me looking at them, or did they think I was still asleep? Because it was so dark inside my room, I wasn't sure if my eyes opening would have been noticeable from outside. That thought alone made the moment feel even more tense. For what felt like a very long time, neither of us moved. In reality, it was probably only a minute or two, but when you're scared like that, time feels stretched out. My heart was pounding so hard I could actually hear it in my ears. I didn't dare sit up suddenly or make any noise because I was afraid it would draw attention to me. Eventually, I realized I needed to get my dad, but doing that meant getting out of bed. Slowly, very slowly, I shifted my body toward the edge of the mattress. I tried to move as quietly as possible so the bed wouldn't creak. Every small movement felt extremely loud in the silent house. My eyes stayed locked on the window the entire time. The figure still hadn't moved. That somehow made it worse. I slid one foot onto the floor, then the other, trying to keep my movements slow and careful. My plan was to quietly leave the room and run upstairs to wake my dad. Once I was standing, I carefully backed away from the window so whoever was outside wouldn't see me clearly. My bedroom door was slightly open, and I slipped through it into the hallway. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I moved much faster. I hurried up the stairs and went straight to my parents' room. My dad woke up pretty quickly when I shook him and told him there was someone outside my window. At first he looked confused, but once he saw how serious I was, he got up right away. We walked back downstairs together. Even though he tried to move quietly, the house still made small sounds as we walked. I remember feeling nervous that the person outside might hear us and run away before my dad could see them. When we reached my bedroom, my dad looked out the window. The person was gone. There was nothing there anymore, just the dark yard and the quiet space between our house and the neighbors. For a moment, we both just stood there staring outside. My dad checked around the side of the house and looked through a few other windows, but whoever had been standing there had completely disappeared. It was like they had simply vanished. My dad decided to call the neighborhood security guard. One of the reasons people liked living in that community was because there was always a guard at the entrance gate, and they regularly drove through the streets during the night. After my dad explained what had happened, the guard said he would come by to check things out. He arrived surprisingly fast, only a few minutes later. I remember standing near the front door with my dad while we explained everything. The guard was listening carefully, asking a few questions about where exactly the person had been standing and how long I had seen them there. The front door was open slightly while we talked so the guard could look around outside, and then something happened that I will never forget. Out of nowhere, the same person walked past our house, not running, not even walking quickly. They were jogging slowly down the street. It wasn't a normal jog either. There was something strange about the way they moved. Their steps looked almost casual, like they weren't in any hurry at all. As they passed the front of our house, they turned their head toward us. Our eyes met. Even though it was still dark outside, I could clearly see their face for a moment under the streetlight. They had a small grin on their face. Not a big smile, just a slight grin, like they knew exactly what they were doing. The moment the guard noticed them, he took off running. He sprinted down the street after the person without saying a word. The man who had been jogging instantly sped up and turned the corner between two houses. Within seconds, they were both gone from sight. The guard searched the area for a while, but he eventually came back and said he couldn't find the person anywhere. With the houses so close together and plenty of small pathways between them, it would have been easy for someone to disappear quickly. Even though the guard stayed around the neighborhood for a bit longer, the person never showed up again that night. After everything settled down, my dad tried to reassure me that everything was okay. He double-checked the doors and windows and told me the guard would keep an eye on the area. But the truth was, I was still completely shaken. Knowing that someone had been standing right outside my bedroom window while I slept was a terrifying thought. That night, I refused to go back to my room. Instead, I slept on the floor in my parents' room. Actually, I didn't just do that for one night. I ended up sleeping there for an entire week. Even during the day, the memory of that grin kept replaying in my mind. I kept thinking about how the person had been standing there watching my window, completely still, and the fact that they casually jogged past our house later, like it was nothing, made the whole thing even creepier. Even now, years later, I still think about that night sometimes. Yeah, I have no idea who that person was or what they were doing outside my window. Maybe they were just some random stranger passing through the neighborhood, or maybe they had been watching the house for a while. Either way, it was one of the few moments in my life where I truly felt that deep, unsettling kind of fear that sticks with you long after the night is over. I live not too far from San Francisco, just across the bridge in one of the small hillside towns. It's an incredibly beautiful place. On clear days, you can see the water stretching out in the distance, the hills rolling into each other, and the houses stacked along the slopes like they're climbing toward the sky. But anyone who lives in this part of California knows that the weather can be strange sometimes. The fog, in particular, can get unbelievably thick. And when I say thick, I mean the kind of fog where you can barely see anything around you. There are mornings when the fog rolls in so heavily that I can't even see my own car sitting in the driveway, even though it's only about 20 feet away from the front door. Everything just disappears into this white-gray wall. The air feels heavy and quiet, like the whole world has been wrapped in a blanket. Usually it's peaceful, but sometimes it feels unsettling. About 2 years ago, I had an experience that I still can't explain. It was a normal school day. Nothing strange had happened at school, and everything was completely ordinary. I was driving home in the afternoon like I always did. My school is only about a 10-minute drive from our house, but the road climbs up into the hills as you get closer to my neighborhood. That day, the fog had already started rolling in while I was leaving town. At first, it wasn't too bad, just patches of mist drifting across the road. But as I drove higher up the hill toward my house, the fog started getting thicker and thicker. By the time I reached the road that leads to our place, it had become incredibly dense. The headlights of my car barely cut through it. Our house sits at the very top of the hill, so I slowly drove up the last stretch of road, squinting through the windshield and trying to stay centered in the lane. I'd lived in that house for most of my life, about 14 years at that point, and nothing unusual had ever happened there before. It was just a quiet house on a quiet hill. When I finally pulled into the driveway, I could barely see the front of the house through the fog. But I did notice one familiar thing. In the window facing the driveway, I could make out the shape of my dog standing there. His tail was wagging like crazy, the way it always did when he saw my car pull in. Even through the fog and the dim light inside the house, I could see his excited little silhouette bouncing back and forth. That part felt normal. I parked the car and opened the door to step out. The moment I did, a sudden blast of wind came rushing down the hill. It slammed my car door shut so hard it made me jump. The wind roared around the house, whipping through the trees and bushes in the yard. The branches rattled and the leaves shook violently as the gusts pushed through them. It sounded like the entire hillside had suddenly come alive. And that was the first moment something felt wrong. Where we live, the weather usually follows a certain pattern. When it's foggy, the air is calm and still. If the wind picks up, the fog usually disappears because the moving air pushes it away. But that day, both were happening at the same time. The fog was thick, almost blinding, and yet the wind was howling down from the higher hills, like a storm was rolling through. I stood there for a moment beside my car, feeling uneasy. Something about the air felt strange. I shook it off and headed toward the front door. When I stepped inside, the house was completely quiet. I called out for my parents. No answer. I called again, louder this time. Still nothing. The only sound was my dog running toward me across the floor, his tail wagging and nails clicking against the hardwood. He looked happy to see me, but there was something slightly restless about him too. He kept glancing toward the stairs and then back at me, like he wasn't sure what was going on. Then I noticed how cold the house was. It felt like walking into a freezer. The air inside was freezing, far colder than it should have been. I stood there for a moment trying to figure out why it was so cold, and that's when I started to feel a little uneasy. Something clearly wasn't right. Our house has 3 floors, and my parents' bedroom is on the very top level. Then, thinking maybe something had been left open upstairs, I headed up the stairs to check. When I reached their room, the reason for the freezing temperature became obvious immediately. Both of their windows were wide open. Not just cracked open, they were slid completely open, letting the wind blast straight into the house. The curtains were flapping violently, snapping and whipping in the air as the cold wind poured inside. That explained why the house felt like an icebox. Still, it seemed strange. My parents were usually very careful about closing everything before they left the house. And with fog rolling in, it would have been even more unusual to leave the windows open like that. But I tried not to think too much about it. I walked over, slid both windows shut, and latched them. The noise of the wind immediately became quieter. Then I turned on the heat to start warming the house back up. After that, I headed downstairs to my bedroom on the bottom floor. By this point, I was feeling pretty tired. The cold air had made me feel drained, and all I wanted to do was relax for a bit. I climbed into my bed with my laptop to work on an essay I'd been writing for school. My dog jumped up onto the bed beside me and curled up against my side, clearly enjoying the warmth under the blankets. For a while, everything felt normal again. I started typing, focusing on my homework, done trying to ignore how cold the room still felt, while the heater slowly worked to warm the house back up. But after a few minutes, something felt off again. The room was still unbelievably cold, not just a little chilly. Freezing, I paused my typing and looked around the room. And that's when my stomach dropped. The windows directly across from my bed were wide open. All of them. Our windows are old sliding windows that make a loud scraping noise whenever you open them. You can't open them quietly. The metal tracks grind and squeal loudly as they move, and I knew for a fact they hadn't been opened when I came into the room. There was no way someone could have opened them without me hearing it. Cold air rushed into the room, carrying the foggy dampness with it. My heart started pounding as I quickly got out of bed and walked over to the windows. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the frame and slid them shut. As one of the windows closed, the glass fogged over slightly from the temperature difference between the cold air outside and the warmer air inside. At first I thought it was just normal condensation, but then I saw something that made my blood run cold. Written in the fog on the glass was a single word. No. The letters were clear, like someone had drawn them slowly with a finger. For a second, I just stared at it, completely frozen. Then pure panic hit me. I rushed out of my room and ran straight into the bathroom down the hall, my dog scrambling after me as if he sensed something was wrong too. I slammed the door behind us and stood there trying to calm my breathing. My heart felt like it was going to explode. I kept telling myself there had to be some logical explanation. Maybe the writing had been there earlier and I just hadn't noticed. Maybe someone had written it days ago and the fog simply made it visible again. But deep down, I knew that didn't make sense. Then I heard something that made the fear even worse. A knock. Someone was knocking on the front door. 3 slow knocks echoed through the quiet house. I stood there in the bathroom, completely terrified. My mind was racing. Who could possibly be at the door right now? My parents weren't home. None of our neighbors would just randomly show up like that. After a minute of silence, I slowly opened the bathroom door. My dog stayed right beside me as I carefully stepped into the hallway. I moved quietly, almost tiptoeing through the house like some nervous cartoon character trying not to be seen. Every small sound made me jump. I slowly walked toward the front door and looked through the peephole. There was nothing there. No one standing outside. Just thick fog covering the driveway and the yard beyond it. I slowly sank down onto the floor beside the couch, trying to calm myself down. From where I was sitting, the large living room couch blocked my view of the huge sliding glass doors across the room. Those doors face the back of the house and stretch almost the entire height of the wall. They're massive, about 15 feet wide and almost 25 feet tall. After a minute, I stood up again and looked toward them, and my stomach dropped all over again. One of the glass doors had fogged over. Written across the condensation were 3 words, "Who am I?" The letters were large and uneven, like they had been traced by a finger across the foggy glass. I didn't wait another second. I grabbed my laptop, my dog, and my car keys and ran out of the house as fast as I could. I jumped in my car and drove straight down the hill, barely even paying attention to the road. I drove nearly 50 miles that night, all the way to my grandfather's house. I stayed there until the next morning. Even now, years later, I still have no idea what happened that day. Nothing like it has ever happened again. There have never been any other strange events in that house. But I can still clearly remember the feeling of seeing those words appear on the glass. My mom believes me when I tell the story. I'm not sure why exactly, but she does. Neither of us has ever been able to come up with a real explanation. And to this day, it remains the single most terrifying moment of my life. When I was about 11 years old, my family lived in an old farmhouse in upstate New York. The house had been standing for nearly 100 years, and it felt like it carried the weight of all those years inside its walls. It was big and spread out, the kind of place where every floor creaked and every hallway seemed longer at night. Outside, there were wide hayfields, old trees, and rolling hills that stretched far beyond what you could see from the house. We lived in a very rural area. The nearest neighbor was about 6 miles away, and at night, the darkness around the house felt incredibly deep. There were no streetlights and no nearby houses glowing in the distance. When the sun went down, it was just the farmhouse sitting quietly in the middle of the fields. Because of that, I was almost never left home alone. But one particular night, I was. My parents had gone to visit another farm nearby. It wasn't far by car, but far enough that if something happened, I'd be by myself for a while. I remember being pretty excited about it because I had something special planned for the evening. There was a big television movie premiering that night called V. If you remember the show, it was a science fiction story about aliens who arrived on Earth looking exactly like humans. They acted friendly at first, pretending they came in peace, but later, people discovered the truth. Underneath their fake human skin, they were actually reptile-like creatures. And the worst part was that they were secretly planning to eat humans. For an 11-year-old kid watching it alone in an old farmhouse, it was the perfect recipe for being scared out of your mind. Still, I was determined to watch it. I settled into the living room with the lights dimmed, sitting near the large picture window that looked out over one of the hayfields beside the house. That window was huge, almost stretching across the entire wall. During the day, it gave you an amazing view of the fields and hills beyond the property. At night, though, it mostly just showed darkness. The movie had been going for a while, slowly building tension as the story unfolded. I was completely pulled into it, leaning forward on the couch and watching every moment carefully. Then the scene happened. In the movie, one of the characters finally discovers the truth about the aliens. During a struggle, the alien's fake human face is torn away, revealing the scaly reptile creature hiding underneath. Right around that exact moment, both of my dogs started growling. They had been lying quietly near the couch while I watched the movie, but suddenly they stood up, stiff and alert. Low growls rumbled from their throats as they stared toward the window. At first I thought maybe they had heard an animal outside, but something about their reaction felt different. Their growls weren't loud barking like when a stranger walked up the driveway. Instead, it was this deep, uneasy sound, like they were warning something to stay away. I turned my head slowly toward the window. Outside, it was completely dark, just like it usually was at night in the countryside. But something looked strange. The darkness seemed lighter than normal. It's hard to explain exactly what I mean by that. It was still night, but the sky had this faint glow to it, like something was illuminating the area from somewhere above. The moment I noticed it, the hair on the back of my neck stood straight up. My dogs suddenly stopped growling. They backed away from the window and moved behind the couch, pressing themselves together in a tight little huddle. I had never seen them behave like that before. These were dogs that normally barked at anything that came near the house, but now they looked scared, and that made me scared. I turned fully toward the window and looked out across the hayfield. That's when I saw it. A bright light suddenly appeared above the fields. It wasn't like a flashlight beam or the headlights of a car. This light was powerful, almost blinding, and it seemed to move incredibly fast. It streaked across the sky above the field in front of the house, casting a strange glow over the land. For a few seconds, everything outside looked illuminated in a pale, eerie light. Then the glowing object shot across the sky and disappeared behind the hill beyond the field. Just like that. The light vanished. It didn't slowly fade away. It simply winked out of existence. I completely lost it. My brain was already filled with images from the movie I had been watching. Aliens disguised as humans, creatures hiding behind fake skin, people being secretly hunted. And now I had just watched a mysterious light fly over our house and vanish behind the hill. To my 11-year-old mind, there was only one possible explanation: aliens, and they were coming to eat me. Without even thinking, I jumped off the couch and ran down the hallway. My dogs bolted after me as I rushed toward the basement stairs. At the time, we kept a small .22 rifle in the house for dealing with pests around the farm. I grabbed it on the way down the stairs and headed straight into the cellar. The basement was dim and smelled faintly of dirt and old wood. I huddled down there with my dogs, clutching the rifle like it was the only thing protecting me. My dogs stayed right beside me the entire time. Every small sound made me jump. The wind outside rustling through the trees sounded like footsteps. The creaking boards of the house above us sounded like someone moving around upstairs. I was convinced the aliens had landed in the field and were coming for me. So I stayed there. I didn't move. I didn't turn the lights on. I just sat in the basement with my dogs, waiting for my parents to come home. Eventually, I heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Relief washed over me instantly. I hurried upstairs to meet them, trying my best to act calm. I didn't want them to think I had completely panicked while they were gone. I casually mentioned the strange light I had seen outside while watching TV. My parents looked at each other for a moment. Then they told me something that surprised me. While they had been visiting the other farm that evening, something strange had happened there too. They said all the animals on the farm had suddenly gone completely silent. The cows, the chickens, even the usual nighttime sounds had stopped all at once. Then they noticed a bright light in the sky. It moved quickly across the area, lighting up the fields for a few seconds before disappearing. My parents admitted that the whole thing had made them uneasy. In fact, it had scared them enough that they decided to head home earlier than they originally planned. Hearing that sent chills down my spine. Even now, many years later, I still think about that night sometimes. Maybe it was just some kind of aircraft or meteor passing overhead, or maybe it was something else entirely. Whatever it was, it remains one of the strangest and most frightening experiences of my childhood. When I was younger, I worked the night shift at a campground. My shift ran from midnight until 8 in the morning, every single night. At first, the idea of working alone all night sounded a little strange, but once I got used to it, the job actually felt pretty relaxed most of the time. The campground was quiet overnight. Most of the guests were asleep in their tents or RVs, and very few people ever came through the entrance that late. On busy nights, I might deal with one or two campers who arrived late or needed help with something, but that was about it. Most of my shift was spent alone. My workspace was a tiny wooden shack near the campground entrance. It was probably about 8 feet by 8 feet inside. Just enough space for a desk, a small chair, and a window that faced the road leading into the campground. The rest of the area around the shack was open land, dark trees, and empty campground roads. At night, the whole place felt incredibly isolated. There were no bright lights like in a city, just a few dim lamps scattered around the campground paths. Once midnight passed, the darkness settled over everything like a thick blanket. The trees beyond the entrance turned into shadowy outlines and the quiet stretched for miles. To pass the time during those long shifts, I usually brought my PlayStation 2 with me. I'd hook it up to a small television in the shack and spend hours playing games. As long as I stayed alert for anyone driving in, my boss didn't mind. The job was mostly about being there in case something happened. During my first week working there, I spent a lot of time talking with the guy who had worked the same shift before me. He was finishing his last few days before quitting, so he showed me how everything worked around the campground. One night while we were talking, he mentioned something strange. A few feet away from the shack where I worked, there was an old payphone mounted on a metal pole. It looked like something from a different time. Most people didn't use payphones anymore, but for some reason, this one had never been removed. He told me that the payphone rang every single night, specifically at 4:17 in the morning, just once. Then it would stop. At first I thought he was joking, but he looked completely serious when he told me about it. He said it had been happening the entire time he had worked there. And every night at the exact same time, the phone would ring once. No second ring, just one. He assumed it was some kind of automated test call from the phone company. Maybe they were checking to make sure the line still worked. But even though he had heard it ring dozens of times, he admitted he had never actually answered it. Something about it always made him uncomfortable. After he left the job, I took over the shift alone. For the first couple of months, I didn't really notice the payphone at all. It was the middle of summer and the nights were still warm even after midnight. To keep the bugs and humid air out of the shack, I usually kept the windows closed. With the windows shut and the PS2 running, I couldn't hear much of anything outside. Because of that, I never heard the payphone ring. Eventually, around the middle of August, the weather started cooling down at night. I began leaving the windows open while I worked so the fresh air could circulate through the shack. That's when I heard it for the first time. It was exactly 4:17 in the morning. I remember glancing at the digital clock on the desk because the sound caught my attention immediately. The payphone rang, just once. The sound was strange. It wasn't the sharp, clear ring you normally hear from a phone. Instead, it sounded muffled and hollow, almost like the phone had been submerged underwater and then pulled back out. It echoed slightly through the quiet campground. Then the sound stopped. I sat there for a moment staring out the window toward the payphone. But after a few seconds, nothing else happened. The phone didn't ring again. It had happened exactly the way the previous worker described. The next night, the same thing happened. At exactly 4:17 in the morning, the phone rang once, then silence. After a few nights of hearing it, my curiosity started getting the better of me. I kept thinking about the explanation the other guy had given me about it being an automated test call. If that was true, answering the phone shouldn't matter. Still, the idea of walking out into the dark campground at 4 in the morning to answer a ringing payphone felt a little unsettling. For a while, I ignored it, but eventually, curiosity won. One night I decided I was going to answer the phone and see what happened. I set an alarm on the desk clock for 4:15 in the morning so I wouldn't miss it. When the alarm went off, I stepped outside the shack and walked over to the payphone. The air was cool and quiet. The trees around the campground barely moved, and the sky was still dark except for a faint hint of early morning on the horizon. I stood there beside the payphone, waiting. 2 minutes later, right on schedule, the phone rang. Once. I quickly picked up the receiver. "Hello?" I said. There was no answer, and all I could hear was silence. Not the kind of silence you get when no one is on the line. It felt more like someone was there but simply wasn't speaking. I tried again. "Hello?" Still nothing, just dead air. After a few seconds, I hung up and walked back to the shack. The next night I tried it again. Same result. The phone rang once, I answered, and there was nothing but silence. For about a week I kept repeating this routine. Every night I would step outside at 4:17, answer the phone, say hello a few times and hear nothing in return. Eventually I got bored with the whole thing. If it really was some kind of automated system testing the line, then the silence made sense. After a week of identical results, I stopped answering the phone and went back to ignoring it. About a month passed. Summer faded into early fall, and the campground started getting quieter as fewer people came to stay overnight. One night during the first week of October, I suddenly remembered the payphone again. For some reason, I felt curious about it all over again, so I decided to answer it one more time, just to see if anything had changed. Like before, I set my alarm for 4:15 and walked out to the payphone a few minutes later. The campground was colder now, and the air carried that crisp feeling that comes with autumn. At exactly 4:17, the phone rang. Once. I lifted the receiver to my ear. "Hello?" I said. No response. "Hello," I repeated. For a moment, it seemed exactly like every other night I had answered the phone. Then I heard something. It sounded like someone inhaling through clenched teeth. The sound was sharp and unnatural, like a breath being pulled through a tight space. Before I could react, a voice came through the receiver. It was one of the roughest voices I had ever heard in my life. It sounded deep and gravelly, like the person speaking had been gargling stones. The closest comparison I could ever think of was a character named Horace P. Gage from a horror video game called The Suffering. That was exactly what the voice sounded like. Low, harsh, almost painful to listen to. The voice spoke only once. It said my name, not just my first name, my full name, first, middle, and last. I had never heard that voice before in my life. The moment it finished speaking, my throat went dry. I couldn't respond. For a few seconds, I just stood there holding the receiver, completely frozen. My heart was pounding so hard, it felt like it was shaking my chest. Then I hung up the phone. My hands were shaking as I reached into my pocket and pulled out some coins. I dropped them into the payphone and dialed *69 to return the last incoming call. The automated voice gave me the number the call had come from. It was from California. I stood there staring at the phone in disbelief, because I was standing in the middle of a campground in Indiana. To this day, I still have no explanation for what happened that night. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. When I was around 16 years old, I had an experience one night that still stands out in my memory. Even now, years later, I sometimes think about it and wonder how close I might have come to getting seriously hurt. At the time, it felt terrifying, but looking back on it, the whole situation almost feels like something or someone might have been watching out for me. It was a normal evening at home. My parents had gone out for the night, leaving me alone in the house. That wasn't unusual. By the time I was 16, staying home by myself for a few hours was completely normal. I actually enjoyed those quiet evenings because it meant I could relax, go online, and talk to friends without anyone interrupting. This was back when MSN Messenger was incredibly popular. If you had internet in the early 2000s, chances were you spent a lot of time chatting with friends on it. Everyone had their little usernames and profile pictures, and you'd sit there typing away for hours talking about random things. That night was exactly like that. I was sitting at my computer in the downstairs room where our family computer was set up. It wasn't a huge room, just a simple space with a desk against the wall, a rolling computer chair, and a ceiling light above the middle of the room. The staircase leading to the upper floor was just outside the doorway. I had MSN open and was chatting with a few friends, sending messages back and forth like usual. The house around me was quiet. It was one of those calm nights where you could hear the faint ticking of the clock on the wall and the occasional sound of a car driving by outside. For a while, everything was completely normal. Then my internet connection suddenly dropped. The MSN window flashed and I saw the message saying I had been signed out. That wasn't too unusual. Our internet connection at the time wasn't always perfect. Sometimes it would cut out for a moment and then reconnect a few seconds later. Sure enough, after a short pause, the connection came back, and MSN signed me back in automatically. I went right back to chatting with my friends. But a few minutes later, it happened again. I got signed out, then signed back in. At first, I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was just one of those random connection issues that happen sometimes. But after the third or fourth time, it started to get annoying. Every time the connection dropped, the conversation would pause. I'd have to wait for MSN to reconnect before I could keep talking. Then the problem started happening more often. Instead of disconnecting every few minutes, the internet began cutting out every minute or so. I'd sign back in, type a message or two, and then the connection would drop again. It felt like the internet was getting worse with each passing minute. Soon, it got to the point where I couldn't stay connected for more than about 30 seconds at a time. MSN would sign in. I'd barely manage to type a few words, and then I'd be kicked offline again. After dealing with it for a while, I finally got frustrated. I remember leaning back in my chair and thinking that the internet clearly wasn't going to cooperate that night. So I decided I'd just leave the computer and do something else until my parents got home. I pushed my chair back from the desk and stood up. The computer chair rolled slightly as I stepped away from it. I walked toward the doorway that led out of the room and toward the staircase. As I reached the doorway, I turned the corner to head upstairs. And at that exact moment, something happened behind me. There was a loud crash. Not just a small noise, a violent, sudden crash that echoed through the entire room. I spun around immediately. The ceiling light fixture had fallen. The entire thing had come loose from the ceiling and dropped straight down onto the spot where I had been sitting just seconds earlier. The glass cover shattered across the floor. Broken pieces scattered everywhere around the computer chair. For a moment, I just stood there staring at the mess in complete shock. If I had stayed sitting in that chair even a few seconds longer, the entire fixture would have fallen directly onto my head. The glass shade alone could have seriously injured me, not to mention the metal parts of the fixture itself. My heart started pounding as the realization sank in. I had been sitting in that exact spot only seconds earlier. The timing of it all felt almost impossible. The moment I decided to leave the computer was the exact moment the light fell. If the internet hadn't kept disconnecting over and over again, I probably would have stayed there for another 10 or 15 minutes chatting with my friends. And if I had done that, the light fixture might have fallen right on top of me. The thought made my stomach turn. I suddenly felt very uncomfortable being alone in the house. The quiet that had felt relaxing earlier now felt unsettling. The broken glass on the floor and the dangling wires from the ceiling made the room look completely different. Without even thinking twice, I ran upstairs. I went straight to my bedroom and climbed into bed, pulling the blankets over myself like a kid hiding from a nightmare. Even though I was 16, I suddenly felt a lot younger. The house creaked softly as the night went on, and every little sound made me jump. I stayed under those blankets for what felt like hours, waiting for the sound of my parents coming home. Eventually, I heard the front door open and their voices downstairs. Only then did I finally feel safe enough to come out of my room. When I told them what had happened, they went downstairs to look at the broken fixture and the glass scattered around the chair. They agreed that I had been incredibly lucky, because if I had still been sitting there when it fell, things could have ended very differently. Even now, I sometimes think back to that strange series of events. The internet disconnecting over and over again. The exact moment I decided to get up. and the light fixture falling right after I left the chair. Maybe it was just a strange coincidence, or maybe some strange bit of luck, fate, or timing pushed me to get up at exactly the right moment. Either way, I walked away from that night without a single scratch, and that's something I've always been grateful for. One night a few years ago, I experienced something that still stands out as one of the strangest and most unsettling moments I've ever had while waking up. Nothing violent happened, nothing physically touched me, and in the end, there was a logical explanation for it. But in the moment when it was happening, it felt incredibly real and deeply disturbing in a way that is hard to explain unless you've experienced something similar. It started like any other normal night. I had gone to bed fairly late, the way I often did at that time. I remember scrolling through my phone for a while, watching random videos and messaging friends, before eventually putting the phone down and turning off the light. My room was quiet, and the hallway light outside my bedroom was still on. That faint light usually leaked through the small gap around my door and created a soft glow across one side of the room. It wasn't bright enough to fully light the room, but it was enough to create outlines and shapes if you opened your eyes during the night. At some point, I must have fallen into a deep sleep. I don't know how long I had been asleep when the strange moment happened, but I remember waking up suddenly without really understanding why. It was the kind of waking where you're not fully conscious yet. Your mind is halfway between dreaming and being awake, and everything feels slow and foggy. My eyes opened slowly. For a few seconds I just lay there, still caught in that half-asleep state where you aren't fully aware of your surroundings. The room was dim, just like it always was when the hallway light shined through the door. Then I noticed something right in front of me. There was a face. It was extremely close to mine, almost nose to nose with me. The face was mostly in shadow because the light from the hallway was behind it, creating a silhouette. I couldn't see clear details like the color of the eyes or the exact shape of the features, but I could clearly see the outline of someone's head and face only inches away from mine. At first, strangely enough, I wasn't scared, because in that strange half-awake state, my brain immediately decided that I knew who it was. I thought it was my best friend. The feeling was oddly certain. Even though I couldn't see his features clearly, my mind filled in the blanks automatically. It felt like he had somehow entered my room and was leaning over my bed to wake me up. So without really thinking about how strange that situation was, I spoke. "Hey man, what are you doing?" I said. My voice sounded thick and sleepy. As I spoke, I started to sit up in bed and move my head slightly to the side. And that's when the moment became truly unsettling. As I moved my head, the face moved with it. But it didn't move the way a normal person's head would move. It stayed the exact same distance from my face the entire time. When I shifted slightly to the left, the face shifted left with me. When I leaned forward a bit, the face leaned forward the same amount. It was like the two of us were somehow locked together at the same distance. At that moment, my brain still hadn't fully processed what was happening. Everything felt slow, like my mind was still wrapped in sleep. I blinked my eyes once, trying to focus better on the shape in front of me, and then the face disappeared, just like that. One moment it was there, only inches away from me. The next moment, it was completely gone. There was nothing in front of me except the empty space of my dark bedroom. I sat there for a second, still half awake and confused. My brain tried to make sense of what had just happened, but everything still felt blurry. I rubbed my eyes and looked around the room slowly. The door was closed. The hallway light was still shining faintly through the gap under the door, but there was no one in the room. For about 2 minutes, I didn't really react strongly. I was still waking up, and my mind hadn't fully caught up with the reality of the situation yet. I just sat there in bed, breathing slowly and looking around. Then it suddenly hit me. My best friend didn't live with me. In fact, he didn't even live nearby. There was no possible way he could have been standing in my room in the middle of the night. He hadn't been visiting that day, and there was no reason for him to be anywhere near my house. The realization sent a sudden wave of fear through me. How my heart started beating faster as I replayed the moment in my head. I remembered exactly how close the face had been. I remembered how it had moved perfectly with my own movement, and I remembered how real it had looked. For a few seconds, I just sat there in silence, staring into the darkness of my room. The quiet felt heavier than usual. Every little sound from the house suddenly seemed louder. I looked around carefully to make sure no one was actually there. The closet door was closed. The desk chair sat where it always did. The faint light from the hallway still cast soft shadows across the walls. There was nothing unusual in the room at all, but the memory of that face was still fresh in my mind. I eventually got out of bed and checked the door just to be sure it was locked. Everything was normal. No one had entered the house, and there was no sign that anyone had been in my room. Still, I didn't feel comfortable going right back to sleep. Instead, I sat there for a while, thinking about what had just happened. The more I thought about it, the stranger it felt. The face had been so clear in that moment. Even though I couldn't see specific details, my brain had been completely convinced that it belonged to someone I knew. It was like my mind had created a familiar identity for the shape in front of me. Eventually, I started researching experiences like that. What I discovered was something called sleep paralysis hallucinations. Most people think of sleep paralysis as a state where you wake up but can't move your body, but there are actually several variations of it. In some cases, people can move normally but still experience vivid hallucinations as their brain transitions between sleep and wakefulness. Those hallucinations can appear extremely real. People often report seeing figures standing in their room, faces hovering near them, or shapes moving in the shadows. Because the brain is still partially in dream mode, it can project images into the real environment around you. The strange part is that the person experiencing it is technically awake. They can sit up, talk, and move around. But the hallucination can remain visible for a few seconds before disappearing completely. Reading about that made me realize that what I had experienced was probably one of those episodes. At some point during the night, my brain had partially woken up, while still holding on to elements of a dream. The result was that my mind projected an image right in front of my face as I woke up. Even knowing that explanation, the memory of that moment still gives me chills sometimes. Because in that brief period between sleep and wakefulness, the face felt completely real. It wasn't blurry or dreamlike. It was right there in front of me, only inches away. And for those few seconds, my brain truly believed someone was standing beside my bed, watching me wake up. Eventually, I managed to calm down and fall back asleep that night. Nothing like that has ever happened to me again. But the experience left a strong impression on me. It made me realize how powerful the human mind can be when it's caught between dreaming and reality. Even now, when I wake up suddenly in the middle of the night, I sometimes remember that moment and glance around the room for a second before relaxing again. Because once you've had an experience like that, it's hard to completely forget how real it felt. When my parents first got married, they had a habit of doing something that most people today would probably consider a little reckless. But to them, it felt like freedom. They loved spontaneous road trips, Instead of planning vacations with detailed itineraries, they would simply pack up the car with a few basic supplies, their tent and their 3 dogs, and head out onto the road. They didn't rely on maps, GPS, or even a particular destination. Their idea of an adventure was to drive until they found a place that looked beautiful and quiet, then stop and camp there for a few days. One thing that made this possible was the fact that in Scotland, wild camping is generally allowed. You can legally camp in many rural areas as long as you respect the land and leave things the way you found them. Because of that, my parents had an incredible amount of freedom to explore the countryside without needing reservations or campsites. They loved that feeling of discovering hidden places. Most of the time, they would just pick a direction and drive. They'd follow winding country roads through hills and forests until they found a meadow, a stream, or a quiet hillside that looked perfect for pitching their tent. Their 3 dogs always came along on these trips. They were large hunting dogs, extremely well trained and very loyal. My dad had spent a lot of time training them, and they were the kind of dogs that followed commands immediately. They were also fearless. If the dogs ever caught the scent of an animal during their trips, they would chase it without hesitation. That kind of confidence made them perfect hunting companions, and my dad trusted them completely. One particular trip became a story that my parents would tell many times afterward. It started like any of their other spontaneous adventures. They had packed the car with camping gear. He loaded the dogs into the back and started driving through the countryside with no particular destination in mind. The day was calm, and the Scottish landscape stretched out around them with rolling hills, open fields, and narrow country roads weaving through small patches of forest. Eventually, they reached a remote road that looked barely used. It climbed upward along a rough hill, winding its way through thick grass and muddy patches. As they approached the start of the road, they saw a man sitting on a tractor nearby. The man looked at their small car and immediately shook his head. "You can't go up there," he told them. My dad asked why. The man explained that the road was in terrible condition. It was steep, muddy, and full of deep potholes. According to him, even driving a tractor up that road could be difficult sometimes. He laughed and added that their little car would never make it. For my dad, that comment sounded less like a warning and more like a challenge. Instead of turning around, he decided they were going to try it anyway. My mom probably should have known at that moment that the trip was about to get interesting. The road was exactly as bad as the man had described. Mud splashed up around the tires as the car slowly crawled uphill. Deep potholes forced my dad to steer carefully around them while the engine struggled against the steep incline. At several points, the car slid slightly in the mud before catching traction again, but somehow, despite all of that, they made it. When they finally reached the top of the hill, the rough road opened into a wide, peaceful clearing. Right away, my dad felt like they had discovered something special. In front of them was a beautiful meadow with a small stream flowing gently across the grass. The water bubbled softly as it moved over smooth stones, yet creating a quiet and relaxing sound that echoed through the open space. Beyond the meadow was a newly planted forest. Hundreds of young trees stood in neat rows, stretching across the land. The saplings were still small, but they had been planted carefully in straight lines that continued for hundreds of meters. At the far end of that planted area stood an older forest. Tall, dark trees formed a thick wall of woodland about 800 meters away. From where my parents stood, the older forest looked dense and ancient compared to the young trees growing in front of it. The entire place felt secluded and untouched. My dad immediately loved it. He later said it felt like discovering a hidden paradise. The meadow, the stream, and the forests surrounding it made the area feel incredibly peaceful. It was the kind of place that seemed almost too perfect to find by accident. They parked the car and stepped outside. That's when my mom noticed something strange. The area was completely silent. The stream was still bubbling gently through the meadow, but aside from that, there were no other sounds. There was no wind moving through the grass, no rustling leaves, and no birds singing in the trees. For a place surrounded by nature, the silence felt unnatural. My mom mentioned that something about the place felt strange, but my dad laughed it off. To him, it just felt like a quiet and peaceful place to camp. He started unloading their gear from the car and preparing to set up the tent near the edge of the meadow. While they worked, the dogs wandered around the clearing, exploring their surroundings. At first, everything seemed normal, but after a while, my parents realized they hadn't seen the dogs for a few minutes. They looked around the meadow and eventually spotted them near the edge of the newly planted forest. The 3 dogs were standing side by side in a straight line. All of them were facing the rows of young trees. Their bodies were stiff, their ears were pointed forward, and the hair along their backs was standing up. Low growls rumbled from their throats as they stared into the forest. My dad immediately noticed how unusual their behavior was. Normally, if the dogs detected an animal nearby, they would instantly chase after it. Their hunting instincts were incredibly strong, and they never hesitated to pursue prey. But this time, they weren't chasing anything. They were just standing there, growling. My dad walked over and tried to call them back to the tent. They obeyed at first and followed him back across the meadow. But the moment he turned away, they slowly crept back toward the edge of the forest again. Their bodies stayed low to the ground as they moved, almost like they were stalking something. When they reached the trees, they resumed the same position as before, standing side by side, growling into the forest. My dad tried again to bring them back. Once again they returned briefly, but within minutes they drifted back toward the trees. No matter how many times he called them, they seemed drawn back to the exact same spot. As time passed, their behavior became more intense. The growling grew louder and their bodies looked tense and anxious. These were dogs that had never ignored my dad's commands before. They were highly trained and extremely obedient. But now they seemed almost frightened, and whatever they were reacting to was hidden somewhere inside the young forest. As the evening progressed, the sky began to darken. Shadows stretched across the meadow, and the distant forest became a dark silhouette against the fading light. The dogs continued growling and pacing near the trees, refusing to calm down. My parents started to feel uneasy. The silence around the meadow still hadn't changed. There were still no birds, no wind, and no other sounds from the surrounding land. It felt like the entire area was holding its breath. Eventually, my dad admitted something didn't feel right. The dogs were clearly sensing something that my parents couldn't see or hear. Their instincts were telling them that something was wrong. And as darkness approached, the idea of camping in that clearing started to feel like a bad decision. My dad made the call. They weren't staying there. Without wasting time, they quickly began packing up their equipment. The tent had barely been set up, but they pulled it down immediately and stuffed it back into the car without even folding it properly. The dogs jumped into the car as soon as the doors opened, clearly eager to leave the place behind. Within minutes, they were driving back down the rough hill road. Neither of my parents spoke much during the drive. They both felt relieved to be leaving the clearing behind them. Eventually, they reached the nearest small village and stopped to figure out exactly where they had been. The area was remote enough that they hadn't recognized the location earlier. Later that night, they arrived at a relative's home where they had originally planned to stay during their trip. They described the strange clearing, the rough road leading up the hill, the meadow with the stream, and the newly planted forest. My mother's uncle listened carefully while they explained everything. Then he pulled out a map of the region. After studying it for a moment, he asked them if the location they described was a particular area marked on the map. My dad looked closely at the map and realized it was exactly where they had been. That's when they learned something unsettling. That same area had recently been connected to the aftermath of the Lockerbie bombing disaster. In the weeks following the explosion, investigators had been searching large sections of the Scottish countryside for debris and human remains that had fallen across the land. Some of those remains had been discovered in the region near the meadow my parents had found. Hearing that explanation sent a chill through both of them. They never returned to that place again. A couple of years ago, something happened to me during a late-night drive that I still think about from time to time. It wasn't the kind of experience where something chased me or threatened me, and nothing physically dangerous happened. But it was one of those strange moments where reality seems to pause for a second, and afterward you're left wondering whether what you saw actually made sense. At the time, I was living in downtown Washington, D.C., Anyone who has spent time in that part of the city knows that during the daytime it's busy, loud, and constantly moving. Cars are everywhere. People are rushing between buildings, tourists crowd the sidewalks, and there's always some kind of activity happening around the government buildings and monuments. But the city feels very different in the middle of the night. Late at night, especially around 3 or 4 in the morning, the streets near the Capitol can become eerily quiet. Most people have gone home, the offices are dark, and the usual noise fades into a strange stillness. The massive buildings that look impressive during the day feel almost surreal at night, standing silently under dim streetlights. That night, I had been out late and was driving back home sometime between 3 and 4 in the morning. I don't remember exactly what I had been doing earlier, but I remember feeling tired and ready to get home and sleep. The roads were almost completely empty. As I drove through the city, the only other vehicles I saw were a few parked police cars and the occasional taxi passing through a distant intersection. The sidewalks were empty, and the quiet made the city feel larger and more open than usual. Eventually, I reached an intersection on the south side of the Capitol. The traffic light ahead of me turned red, so I slowed down and stopped at the line. Technically, at that hour, I probably could have just driven through the intersection without stopping. There were no other cars around, and no pedestrians anywhere in sight. But for some reason, I felt like I should stop anyway. So I did. I sat there in the stillness of the early morning, waiting for the light to change. The glow from the traffic signal reflected faintly on the pavement in front of my car. The buildings around the intersection stood quiet and dark, their windows mostly black except for an occasional light in the distance. With nothing else happening, I found myself looking around out of boredom. I glanced to the left, then straight ahead, then casually over to the right side of the intersection. That's when I saw him. Standing near the corner was a man. At first glance, that might not sound unusual, but something about him immediately caught my attention, even in the dim light. And his appearance looked completely out of place for the time and location. The man was dressed in clothing that looked like it belonged in a different century. He was wearing what appeared to be a full late 1800s style outfit. The kind of clothing you might see in an old photograph or historical film set in New York during the 19th century. He had on a dark 3-piece suit that looked formal and carefully tailored. In one hand, he held a walking cane. On his head sat a tall top hat that must have been nearly a foot high. The entire outfit reminded me of something I had once seen described as a Bowery Boys style, which was a fashion associated with certain groups of men in the late 1800s. It looked incredibly old-fashioned, completely out of place for someone standing on a street corner in modern Washington, D.C. I stared at him, trying to process what I was seeing, because it didn't make sense. At that hour of the night, you might expect to see someone walking home from a bar or waiting for a ride, but you wouldn't expect to see someone dressed like they had stepped out of a 19th century photograph. The lighting around the intersection wasn't very bright, so I couldn't clearly see his face. The shadow from the tall hat covered most of his features, but I could clearly see the shape of his clothing and the way he stood. He appeared calm and perfectly still. And what made the moment even stranger was that I had absolutely no idea where he had come from. I had just been looking around the intersection seconds earlier, and the street had been completely empty. Yet suddenly he was standing there, as if he had appeared out of nowhere. The traffic light turned green. For a moment I didn't move. I was still staring at the man, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Eventually I slowly pressed the gas pedal and began to drive forward through the intersection. As my car approached him, I found myself completely focused on the strange figure standing on the corner. I wasn't driving fast. In fact, I was probably moving slower than I normally would through an intersection. My attention was entirely on the man. As I pulled closer, he made a small movement. With one hand, he reached up and removed his top hat. The motion was slow and deliberate, almost theatrical. As he lifted the hat, I could finally see the top of his head more clearly. His hair was neatly parted straight down the middle and smoothed flat, almost as if it had been carefully styled with an excessive amount of hair gel. Then he tipped the hat slightly toward me. It was the kind of polite gesture you might see in an old movie where someone greets a passerby by tipping their hat. That simple gesture sent a strange chill through me. It felt oddly formal and completely out of place for the moment. I continued driving past him, still watching him out of the corner of my eye as my car moved through the intersection. For a few seconds, my entire focus was on that figure standing under the streetlight in his old-fashioned suit. Then I passed him. Almost immediately, curiosity made me glance up at my rear-view mirror. I wanted to see which direction he was going. Maybe he would start walking down the sidewalk. Maybe he was heading somewhere nearby, but when I looked in the mirror, I saw nothing. The street corner behind me was empty. There was no man standing there. There was no figure walking away. There was no sign that anyone had been there at all. It was as if he had simply vanished. I slowed down slightly, confused, and checked the mirror again. Still nothing. The sidewalk behind me was completely empty. For a moment I even considered turning around to go back and check the intersection again. But something about the situation made me hesitate. Instead, I kept driving toward home, my mind racing with questions. Maybe he had stepped quickly behind a building or into a doorway. Maybe I had somehow missed him in the mirror. But the strange part was how quickly he had disappeared. The timing didn't seem possible. The entire moment felt surreal. By the time I reached my apartment, the image of that man was still stuck in my mind. I kept replaying the moment when he tipped his hat and the second afterward when he had completely vanished from view. It wasn't the kind of experience that felt like a typical scary story. Nothing attacked me and there was no clear danger. But something about the encounter felt deeply strange. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment again. The quiet intersection, the man in the old-fashioned suit, and the way he calmly tipped his hat before disappearing from sight. Even now, years later, I still wonder what exactly I saw that night, and whether that man was ever really there at all. A few years ago, I experienced something that changed the way I look at life forever. It is not a ghost story, and it isn't something supernatural. It is simply a moment that still lives very clearly in my memory. The kind of memory that never really fades, no matter how many years pass. Even now, when I think about it, certain images come back so vividly that it almost feels like I'm standing there again. At the time, I was living in a rented house with 2 roommates. It was a fairly ordinary place, nothing special about it. Just a typical house shared by 3 people, trying to save money while working and going about their daily lives. The neighborhood was quiet, the street lined with similar homes, and most nights everything felt peaceful and uneventful. Our routines were simple. During the day, everyone had their own schedules with work or other responsibilities. In the evenings, we would sometimes cook dinner, watch television, or just sit around talking for a while before eventually heading off to bed. Nothing about that house ever gave me a strange feeling. It was simply a place where we lived. One night, though, everything changed. I had gone to bed like I normally did. The house was quiet, and the night felt completely ordinary. I don't remember hearing anything unusual before I fell asleep. There were no strange sounds, no alarms, nothing that suggested something was about to go terribly wrong. By sometime later in the night, I suddenly woke up. At first, I wasn't fully aware of what had pulled me out of sleep. My mind was still foggy, caught somewhere between dreaming and waking. But almost immediately, I noticed something that made my body react. There was smoke in the house. The smell hit me before anything else. It was thick and sharp, the kind of smell that instantly triggers alarm in your brain. My eyes began to sting slightly, and the air in the room felt heavier than normal. Now, one of my roommates was standing near my door. She had been the one who woke me. Her voice was urgent, telling me that something was wrong and that we needed to get out of the house right away. The moment she said that, the situation became very real. Adrenaline hit instantly. I jumped out of bed and moved quickly, not even stopping to think about grabbing anything from the room. My only thought was getting outside as fast as possible. The hallway was hazy with smoke. It wasn't completely filled yet, but there was enough of it drifting through the air that it made breathing uncomfortable. Somewhere in the house there was a fire growing, and the smoke was spreading quickly. All 3 of us rushed toward the front door. The moment we stepped outside, the cool air hit my face, and I finally had a chance to fully understand what was happening. Our house was on fire. Flames were visible through parts of the structure, and smoke poured upward into the night sky. The sound of crackling wood and breaking materials filled the air as the fire spread. We stood there in the yard watching the house burn. The entire moment felt surreal, almost like watching something happening in a movie rather than real life. The house we had lived in, the place where we had spent countless ordinary days, was now being consumed by flames. Emergency vehicles began arriving quickly. The police cars and fire trucks pulled up with flashing lights that painted the entire scene in red and blue. Firefighters jumped out of the trucks and began preparing their equipment while shouting instructions to each other. It was chaotic and overwhelming. At some point during all of this, something happened that I didn't fully understand at the time. The same roommate who had woken me up suddenly ran back toward the house. To this day, I don't know exactly why she did it. Maybe she thought someone else was still inside. Maybe she believed she had left something important behind. Maybe she simply reacted without thinking, the way people sometimes do in moments of panic. Whatever the reason, she ran back into the burning house. Everything happened so quickly that there wasn't time to stop her. The firefighters were already working to control the flames, and the police were trying to keep everyone at a safe distance. The scene was loud and confusing, filled with shouting voices and flashing lights. An officer eventually guided me toward the back seat of a police car. It was cold outside, and the officer told me to sit there where it was warm while they continued working. I remember the interior of the car feeling strangely calm compared to the chaos outside. Through the back window, I watched everything unfold. Firefighters were moving quickly around the property, spraying water toward the flames and breaking through parts of the structure to reach the fire inside. Then I saw something happening in the driveway. Several people were gathered around someone lying on the ground. At first, I couldn't see clearly what was going on, but after a few seconds, it became obvious. It was my roommate. She had been brought out of the house by the firefighters. Emergency responders were performing CPR on her right there in the driveway. Their movements were urgent and precise, working as quickly as possible to try to bring her back. From where I sat in the police car, everything felt distant and unreal. I watched them working, hoping that somehow she would respond, hoping that she would suddenly start breathing again and that everything would somehow turn out okay. But that didn't happen. She died that night. The reality of it took time to fully sink in. In the hours that followed, the investigators and firefighters continued examining the house to understand how the fire had started and what had happened inside. Eventually, after the flames had been put out and the building was safe enough to enter, we were allowed to go inside briefly to see the damage. The inside of the house looked completely different. Walls were blackened with soot. Furniture had been destroyed, and everything carried the heavy smell of smoke and burned materials. But one detail stood out more than anything else. On one of the walls were handprints. They were dark and smeared across the surface, clearly visible against the damaged wall. You could follow them like a trail moving down the hallway. Each mark told a story of someone trying to move forward through smoke and confusion. The handprints led toward the bathroom. There was a final smear near the edge of the bathtub. That was where the firefighters had found her before carrying her outside. Seeing those handprints was something I will never forget. They were silent evidence of the desperation she must have felt in those final moments inside the burning house. Each mark on the wall represented an attempt to move forward, to find safety, to survive. Even now, years later, that image stays with me. Out of everything that happened that night, it is those handprints that remain the most powerful memory. They were a reminder of how quickly life can change, and how fragile even the most ordinary moments really are. Some memories fade over time, but that one never will. A few years ago, I started practicing Qigong as part of my daily routine. I had always been interested in meditation, mindfulness, and different methods of calming the mind, and Qigong seemed like a fascinating practice to explore. It's an ancient Chinese system that combines breathing, focus, slow movements, and meditation. Many people practice it for relaxation, health, and mental clarity. When I first began learning about it, I read several books and watched instructional videos to understand the techniques properly. The idea behind Qigong is that you focus your mind and breathing in a way that helps balance your internal energy. The practice encourages calmness, awareness, and deep concentration. Because meditation requires quiet and consistency, I decided to practice it at night. Late evenings were the only time when the house was completely silent. There were fewer distractions, fewer sounds from outside, and I could sit undisturbed for as long as I wanted. Most nights I would sit in my basement where I had enough space to be comfortable. The basement was a finished room that also had my computer set up and a large plasma television mounted along one wall. It was the place where I usually relaxed after work, watched movies, or played games. My meditation sessions usually lasted about 20 minutes. I would sit comfortably, close my eyes, and focus on my breathing. The process was slow and calm. Over time, I started becoming better at clearing my mind and allowing my thoughts to settle. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfectly normal, but eventually I started noticing something strange. During some meditation sessions, I would hear small tapping sounds coming from my television. At first, the noise was subtle. It sounded almost like someone lightly flicking the plastic casing on the back of the TV with their finger. A quick little tap, then silence. The first few times I heard it, I didn't think much about it. Large televisions sometimes make strange noises as they cool down after being turned off. Heat expands and contracts materials, and plastic or metal parts can click or pop quietly. Since I usually meditated after watching TV, I assumed that was all it was. Still, the timing was odd. Every time I heard one of those tapping sounds while meditating, it caused a small jolt of surprise in my mind. My body would react slightly, and behind my closed eyelids I would sometimes see flashes of strange colors or patterns. Anyone who meditates knows that visual effects like that can happen when your eyes are closed and your mind is deeply focused. The brain sometimes produces unusual visual sensations during meditation, so I tried not to worry about it. Over the next few weeks, the tapping sounds continued to appear occasionally. They were never constant, just small single taps that happened while I was sitting quietly. Because Qigong is often associated with energy and internal awareness, I even came up with a strange explanation in my head. Some people believe meditation can create subtle electromagnetic changes in the body. I wondered if maybe that was somehow interfering with the electronics in the room. It sounded unlikely, but at the time it felt like a possible explanation. One night I decided to test that idea. Instead of turning the television on during the evening like I normally did, I kept it off the entire day. My plan was to eliminate the possibility that it was simply cooling down from being used. Later that night, I sat down to meditate like usual. The room was quiet, my eyes were closed, and my breathing was steady. After a few minutes, I heard the tapping again, but this time it wasn't coming from the television. The sound came from my computer monitor on the other side of the room. That caught my attention immediately. It sounded exactly the same as the tapping I had heard before, a quick, sharp tap against the surface of the monitor. I stopped meditating and opened my eyes. The room looked completely normal. Nothing was touching the monitor, and nothing had fallen against it. To rule out any electrical explanation, I decided to go a step further. I unplugged both the television and the computer monitor from the wall completely. Then I sat back down and closed my eyes again. Now, a few minutes later, the tapping sound returned. Tap, tap. This time it seemed to come from both the television and the monitor at different moments. That was the point where things stopped making sense to me. If there was no electrical current running through those devices, there was no obvious reason they should be making noise. And the strangest detail of all was that it only happened while I was meditating. The tapping never happened when I was simply sitting in the room doing something else. It only occurred when I closed my eyes and began practicing Qigong. I started to wonder if I was imagining it. Maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. Meditation can make you very aware of small sounds that you normally ignore. Maybe I had simply become overly sensitive to normal house noises, but the sounds felt too clear and deliberate for that explanation. Eventually, curiosity pushed me to try another experiment. The next time I meditated, I opened the voice recorder app on my phone and placed the phone directly in front of the television screen. My idea was simple. If the sound really existed, it would appear in the recording. If it didn't appear, then the sound was probably just in my imagination. I sat down and meditated for about 20 minutes like usual. When I finished, I played the recording. Within the first few minutes of audio, the tapping sound was clearly audible. It sounded like someone lightly tapping on glass. The television screen itself was made of glass, which made the sound even more noticeable. I listened to it several times to be sure. The taps were unmistakable. At that point, I showed the recording to my girlfriend. I wanted to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. She listened carefully and confirmed that she could hear the tapping too. That made the situation even more confusing. Now I knew the sound was real, but I still had no idea what was causing it. Out of curiosity, I began researching meditation experiences related to Qigong. I wanted to see if anyone else had reported unusual sounds or sensations during practice. Some of the material I found online was surprisingly strange. According to certain Qigong books and discussions, intense meditation practices were sometimes believed to attract spiritual entities. Some traditions describe the possibility of encountering negative or disruptive presences while practicing deep meditation. Personally, I didn't fully believe those explanations, but reading them still made me uneasy. My television and computer were both located in the basement, so I decided to change my meditation location just to see if anything changed. Instead of meditating downstairs, I moved my sessions to the living room upstairs. The living room had a couch placed directly in front of a large bay window. It was a comfortable spot with plenty of space and fresh air from outside. One evening, I sat down on the couch and began meditating there. For the first few minutes, everything felt normal. The room was quiet, and I focused on my breathing the same way I always did. I remember thinking that maybe the strange sounds had been related to something specific in the basement environment. Then it happened again. Tap, tap, tap. This time the sound came from the window directly behind my head. The tapping was loud and clear, as if someone was tapping their finger against the glass from outside. The sudden noise startled me so badly that I immediately jumped up and turned around. I switched on the outdoor lights and looked through the window. There was nothing there. No person, no animal, no branches touching the glass. The yard outside was completely empty. That moment genuinely frightened me. For the first time, I started feeling like something unusual might actually be happening inside my house. So over the next several weeks, the strange events continued. The tapping sounds appeared occasionally while I meditated. Sometimes they came from objects in the room. Sometimes they came from walls or windows. Even when I tried to ignore them, the noises seemed to persist. The worst part was the strange feeling I sometimes experienced during meditation. Occasionally, I would feel as if something was standing very close in front of me. It wasn't something I could see, but the sensation was strong enough to make me open my eyes suddenly. Every time I did, the room was empty. Other times I would hear sounds coming from the laundry room connected to the basement. Once or twice I even heard what sounded like someone using the bathroom and flushing the toilet when I was completely alone in the house. For a while, I wondered if stress or overthinking might be causing my mind to exaggerate normal household sounds, but the experience still left me deeply unsettled. The strange tapping noises continued for nearly 3 months. Even now, I still don't have a clear explanation for what caused them, whether it was something psychological, environmental, or something else entirely. It remains one of the strangest periods of my life. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments, and in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.